In the early days of anthropologists went around in a lurid fashion, tried to document all the kinds of things that people were doing all over the world. And their documentation of various sexual positions and who would marry who and who would have sex with whom was probably more a reflection on their own society than it was of actual practices. The only thing that they figured was true across societies was what anthropologists call the incest taboo. You should not be married to, have offspring with, or sex with someone who is too close to you in terms of your kinship. So there's an idea that is found around the world. People put various limits on it, though. Some people make it very close, and for others, it's different. As we talked about, some societies are fairly endogamous when it comes to their relationships, even with what we would consider too close kin. The other thing is that many societies around the world, both in the old days and in the nowadays, would consider things that we think of as homosexual acts to be normal or not outside the range of what people do. Now, what I want to be careful with, though, is that doesn't mean that people identify as, we might say, as gay or straight. So what I mean by this is that all throughout human history, there have been people who do all kinds of things, some of which are considered normal in their society, including same-sex relationships and same-sex actions. However, it's actually only recently, at least in human history in the last 100 years or so, that people think that that defines you as a person and makes you heterosexual or homosexual. So even in today's societies, there are some people who would act in a way that we would consider to be a homosexual activity who don't consider themselves to be homosexual. It's not a thing that is necessarily an identity. Now, these kinds of things can be seen in all sorts of places in prehistory as well, in archaeological artifacts. I'm not sure what to say about this, except every so often in archaeology, you gotta love it. Yeah, it looks like, yeah. However, our textbook urges us to be careful when we interpret, be careful when we interpret stuff without having some interpretation behind it. So this was found in Peru from a long time ago, and it looks like what we think about, but what we should be careful of is simply projecting our ideas of what we would consider to be pornography or that they had sanctioned homosexuality onto the path. In this case, for example, these kinds of objects were found in high status tombs. That is, people who had more social standing, the elites of this society. And so what some people speculate is that this may not have been necessarily a depiction or a guide to oral sex, but more like the idea that people are transferring a valuable substance along a line of inheritance. Now, maybe that's a little bit out there, but the point of the matter is we have to be careful with our interpretations of what objects mean outside of their context, and we shouldn't project our own notions onto the past. One other way in which our own notions got projected onto the past was in the discovery of these two skeletons intertwined in Modena, Italy, who were then depicted as the lovers, or called the lovers of Modena because when they died, they were intertwined in this embrace. We later found out through genetic analysis that these are two males buried together. Now, again, we should not assume, though, that meant that they identified as being gay. We don't know anything about them, but when these skeletons were originally dug up, everybody just assumed that this was a man and a woman together, and that's why they're the lovers of Modena. Once they found out they were a man and a man. What is a big word that causes us to believe that when we dig up two skeletons in an embrace, it's probably a man and a woman? What causes us to assume that? Of
course, heterosexual.
Yeah, so the big word for it comes up in your textbook, but the big word for that is called heteronormativity. Is that when we assume that those two people buried in embrace are going to be heterosexual people, a man and a woman. And so heteronormativity is when we assume that heterosexual orientation and sexual activities are normal, and when other sexual configurations are abnormal, or you wouldn't even think about it. Now, again, I want to be very careful that we don't want to project our own ideas about homosexuality, heterosexuality, all those things onto past or other people's. But the anthropological record is pretty clear that in terms of the activities that people have with each other, people do all sorts of funny stuff and consider that normal or don't even consider it worth remarking upon. Now, in many societies, though, perhaps including our own, doing something like trying to figure out where your gender, sex, sexuality maps up onto this little graph that they give you is something of a, it can be seen as something of a political activity. And so, yeah, in the last class, I'm a little bit scared to give you the gender sex challenge because these have become a political statement to even think in this way. Let's go to another society. Yeah, so it's an interesting example of something that wouldn't seem to have a political implication, but even in places where having premarital sex or sex outside of marriage would be considered prohibited, it could be seen as a political activity or a way of expressing yourself. Not sure if that's where we're going in our society or not, but here we are. Some people leave their own society and then go somewhere else in order to, and this is called sex tourism, where people go from one society to another looking for certain experiences. It is very often associated with people from wealthier countries going to less poorer places, and the relationships that are established there are often can be seen as exploitative. The end of this chapter, though, gives us a couple surprises about this. Yeah. Well, here we have an example from the Caribbean in this picture. What's going on there? Yeah, so this is a surprise. In general, yes, it is true that sex tourism has often been about wealthier white European or white American men going and trying to find the novelty and exoticization of other societies. This is often not the greatest idea, let's put it that way. However, it can involve, as your textbook says, it can involve all genders. And in this case, they talk about women from Europe in general coming into the Caribbean and seeking out relationships with local men as a form of sex tourism. The other surprise here is that although this is often an exploitative relationship, it's not something we want to promote, but that when you talk to the people themselves who are actually engaged in this work, the sex workers themselves don't always see themselves as being exploited. They sometimes see themselves as using this form of work to have a form of liberation or have a form of making their way in society. Now, again, I'm not saying this is a great idea, but it's important not to simply try to make things necessarily illegal or clamp down on things in a in a way in which is we automatically assume that this would be bad. It's just something that is complicated and we have to be careful about. For example, in your book also gives us the example of Germany, in which sex work is legalized. And since it's legalized, it's pretty regulated. It can be a relatively safe form of making a living. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's great. In fact, they also point out that the people who are engaged in this work are often stigmatized and looked down upon, and that many people who do sex work, even in Germany, are not national and are minorities. So there's still that exoticization, that idea that you should have a novel experience with someone who is other than you. So again, this is not something we necessarily want to promote, but it is something that we want to think about when we're thinking about regulating how we try to regulate people's bodies and their relationships. Sex work is probably one of the oldest professions, and in some ways, it's probably not going to be able to stop it by legal means. So maybe we should copy the Germans or be more like the French or the Germans in terms of their social permissiveness and legality.